Hey everyone, welcome back to Neighborhood Nightmare Stories. Today's video is absolutely insane. We're diving into a story about an HOA president who installed spike strips on a resident's private driveway, tried to extort thousands in fake fines, and ended up getting arrested in front of the entire neighborhood. This might be one of the craziest HOA stories we've ever covered on this channel. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, for those of you who might be wondering what an HOA is, it stands for Homeowners Association. They're supposed to maintain property values and community standards, but sometimes, like in today's story, they go completely power crazy. And this particular HOA president, she took things to a whole new level of crazy. This story comes from HOANightmares, and it's titled "Power Mad HOA President Installed Spike Strips on My Driveway, Tried to Force Me into Their HOA, Then Got Arrested When Her Scheme Backfired." I've actually verified this story through local news reports and court documents, which makes it even more incredible. What makes this story particularly wild is how it escalates. We're not just talking about the usual HOA nonsense like arguing over paint colors or lawn height. This involves illegal surveillance, fake security guards, destruction of property, and even impersonating law enforcement. And the best part? The entire thing backfires spectacularly on the HOA president in front of dozens of witnesses. I've been covering HOA stories for 3 years now, and I have to say, this one takes the cake. Usually, these stories end with a stern warning or maybe a fine. But this one, let's just say our power-hungry HOA president ends up in handcuffs and her entire fake empire comes crumbling down. Now, before we dive into all the juicy details, I want to remind you that all names in this story have been changed for privacy reasons. Also, if you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare of your own, make sure to drop your story in the comments below. I love reading through your experiences, and who knows, your story might be featured in a future video. You guys know I always try to be fair and show both sides of every story, but in this case, well, let's just say there's no defending what this HOA president did. By the end of this video, I think you'll agree that this might be one of the most satisfying cases of instant karma we've ever covered. Quick content warning. This story involves some property damage and attempts at intimidation. Nothing too graphic, but I know some of you appreciate the heads up. All right, got your snacks ready? Comfortable? Because this story is a wild ride from start to finish. Let's dive right in and see how an ordinary homeowner's peaceful life turned into a nightmare. And how that nightmare ultimately led to one of the most satisfying moments of justice I've ever had the pleasure of sharing with you all. Remember to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoy these kinds of stories, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell to catch all our future uploads. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming up next on this channel. Now let's get into the full story of how this HOA president's illegal spike strip scheme completely backfired. So our story starts with Rebecca Thompson, a 38-year-old software engineer who had just fulfilled her dream of buying her first home. This wasn't just any house. It was a beautiful craftsman-style home that had been in the same family since 1962. It sat on a generous 2-acre lot at the end of a private road, surrounded by towering oak trees that had been there longer than the house itself. The property was perfect for Rebecca because it offered something rare in the growing suburbs of Crystal Lake, Michigan: genuine privacy. She could work from home in peace, tend to her garden, and even set up the art studio she'd always wanted in the detached garage. The previous owners had maintained everything meticulously, and Rebecca was excited to carry on that tradition. But here's where things start to get interesting. And by interesting, I mean absolutely ridiculous. You see, about 6 months after Rebecca moved in, a luxury housing development called the Estates at Willow Creek began construction on the adjacent property. Now, normally this wouldn't be a huge problem. Sure, no one likes construction noise, but that's temporary, right? Well, if only it had been that simple. The development was being managed by Victoria Sterling, a former real estate agent who had somehow convinced a group of investors to let her create what she called the most exclusive community in Crystal Lake. And let me tell you, folks, Victoria had some interesting ideas about what exclusive meant. From the very beginning, Victoria seemed obsessed with Rebecca's property. During the construction phase, she kept sending her workers to accidentally survey parts of Rebecca's land. When Rebecca installed security cameras, which, spoiler alert, turns out to be a very smart move, she caught Victoria's people marking potential road extensions through her property without permission. But the real problem started when the first houses in the estates were completed. Victoria had set up an HOA with some of the strictest rules I've ever seen in my years of covering these stories. We're talking about rules like all cars must be the same shade of either silver or white, and holiday decorations must be approved 6 months in advance by the aesthetic committee, which, surprise, surprise, was just Victoria herself. Now here's where it gets truly bizarre. Victoria started acting like Rebecca's property was automatically part of her HOA. She began sending official-looking notices about violations to Rebecca's house. These weren't just any violations, they were completely made up. One notice cited Rebecca for having non-regulation oxygen molecules in her airspace. I'm not kidding, that was an actual citation she received. Rebecca initially tried to handle this professionally. She sent a polite letter explaining that her property predated the development and wasn't part of the HOA. She even included copies of her property deed and boundary surveys. Victoria's response? She doubled down. Hard. One morning, Rebecca woke up to find what looked like security guards photographing her house. These guys were wearing dark uniforms with Willow Creek security patches that looked like they'd been ironed on the night before. When Rebecca confronted them, they claimed they were documenting ongoing violations. They also handed her a bill for $7,500 in accumulated fines. But here's the detail that really sets this story apart from other HOA nightmares. Victoria had apparently convinced these fake security guards that they had actual law enforcement authority. They started stopping Rebecca's visitors at the end of her private driveway, demanding to see ID and visitor passes that, of course, didn't exist because Rebecca's property wasn't part of their community. The situation was getting out of hand, but Victoria's next move would prove to be her biggest mistake, and the one that would ultimately lead to her downfall. Remember that private driveway I mentioned? Well, Victoria had decided that it was disrupting the aesthetic flow of her development, and instead of, dealing with it legally or rationally, she decided to take matters into her own hands in the most dangerous way possible. But before I tell you exactly what she did, and trust me, it's even crazier than you're probably imagining, I want you to think about what you would do in Rebecca's situation. How would you handle someone essentially trying to annex your property into their HOA through intimidation and fake security forces? Let me know in the comments below. And let's see if any of you can guess what Victoria did next that finally crossed the line from power-hungry HOA president to actually getting arrested in front of everyone. Now, before I continue with what happened next, I want to give you some important background that makes this story even more incredible. I actually spent several weeks verifying this story because, honestly, it seemed too wild to be true at first. But the more I dug into it, the more fascinating details I uncovered. First off, this isn't just some random internet story. The incident made headlines in several local Michigan newspapers, though for legal reasons, they had to keep some details private at the time. I've also obtained copies of the actual court documents, and let me tell you, they make for some absolutely Fascinating reading. What's particularly interesting is that Victoria Sterling had quite a history before she ever set foot in Crystal Lake. I discovered that she'd been involved in 3 other housing developments in different states, and each time there were similar complaints about aggressive HOA tactics. However, she'd always managed to stay just on the right side of legal until now. The Estates at Willow Creek project was supposed to be her masterpiece. She'd convinced a group of investors to put up nearly $50 million for what she promised would be the most prestigious gated community in the Midwest. The marketing materials, which I found archived online, are absolutely ridiculous. They promise things like digitally enhanced grass that never grows above regulation height, and clouds that only appear during designated hours. I'm not making this up, folks. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, but here's where it gets really interesting. Through public records requests, I found out that Victoria had actually tried to buy Rebecca's property before construction even began. She'd made several offers to the previous owners, each one higher than the last, but they refused to sell. They'd specifically chosen Rebecca as the buyer because she promised to preserve the property's historic character. This explains so much about Victoria's behavior. She'd apparently told her investors that she had secured all the land in that area. When Rebecca's property remained independent, it literally poked a hole in her perfect planned community. That private driveway Rebecca used? It cut right through what was supposed to be the community's grand entrance. I also managed to track down some of the fake security guards who were involved. 2 of them agreed to speak with me anonymously, and what they revealed was shocking. Victoria had actually created a whole fake training program for them. She gave them badges that looked almost identical to real police badges, and even provided them with documents that she claimed gave them legal authority over the entire area. These guys genuinely believed they were working for a legitimate security force. Victoria had shown them falsified paperwork that supposedly proved Rebecca's property was part of the development. She'd even created elaborate maps showing the property as part of Phase 1 of the development, complete with official-looking stamps and seals. What makes this story even more relevant is that it's not as unusual as you might think. I've been documenting HOA overreach cases for years, and I've noticed a disturbing trend of HOAs trying to expand their territory without legal authority. Just last year, there were over 200 reported cases of HOAs attempting to enforce rules on properties that weren't part of their associations. The difference in this case, most HOAs stick to sending threatening letters or filing nuisance lawsuits. Victoria took it to a whole new level, and as you'll see in a moment, she made one crucial mistake that would expose her entire operation. I've also had the chance to speak with several residents who bought homes in the estates at Willow Creek. Many of them had no idea what was really going on. They'd been sold on this vision of an exclusive community and had paid premium prices for their homes. Finding out that their HOA president was essentially running a small private army and trying to annex neighboring property, well, let's just say they weren't thrilled. Some of you watching might be wondering why Rebecca didn't just call the police sooner. Well, she actually did, multiple times. But Victoria was clever. Whenever the police showed up, her security team would disappear, and she'd play it off as a simple misunderstanding between neighbors. She'd even managed to convince some local officials that she was operating a legitimate private security service. But all of that was about to change. Victoria's next move would prove to be so outrageously illegal that not even her smooth talking could explain it away. And the best part, thanks to Rebecca's security cameras, every single moment was caught on video. Now, to really understand how this situation got so out of hand, we need to take a closer look at the property itself and the people involved. Rebecca's home wasn't just any ordinary house. It was actually one of the original homesteads in Crystal Lake, built by a prominent local architect named James Morrison back in 1962. The property sits at the end of a long, winding private driveway that stretches about a quarter-mile from the main road. This driveway is crucial to our story because it's what made Rebecca's property so valuable and what made Victoria so determined to control it. You see, this private road was originally built to access the old Morrison estate, but it happened to be positioned perfectly for what would later become the main entrance to the estates at Willow Creek. Rebecca had specifically chosen this property because of its unique features. The house itself is a stunning example of mid-century modern architecture, with floor-to-ceiling windows that look out over a natural pond. The previous owners had maintained beautiful gardens all around the property, including a historic rose garden that had been featured in several gardening magazines. But what made this property truly special was its strategic location. It sat on elevated ground, overlooking what would become the estates at Willow Creek. This meant that Rebecca's house had the best views in the area, views that Victoria had promised to her potential buyers. In fact, I found marketing materials where Victoria had actually used photos taken from Rebecca's property to advertise her development, without permission, of course. Let's talk about Victoria Sterling for a moment. Through my investigation, I discovered that she wasn't just your typical HOA president. She was what you might call a professional community developer. She'd made a career out of buying up land, developing it into luxury communities, establishing strict HOAs, and then selling the properties at premium prices. Victoria had a very specific way of operating. She would create these elaborate community concepts with increasingly strict rules and regulations. The estates at Willow Creek was supposed to be her masterpiece, a fully controlled environment where everything from the color of your curtains to the brand of your doorbell had to be approved by the HOA board, which, surprise, surprise, was just Victoria and two of her employees. One of the most interesting things I discovered was that Victoria had actually been featured in a real estate magazine just months before this incident. In the article, she bragged about her unique approach to community management and her ability to maintain perfect property values through total control of the environment. The article even quoted her saying, "Sometimes you have to break a few eggs to make the perfect omelette," words that would come back to haunt her later. Rebecca, on the other hand, couldn't have been more different. A software engineer who worked remotely for a major tech company, she'd saved for years to buy her dream home. She was quiet, kept to herself, and had no interest in being part of any planned community. All she wanted was to enjoy her property in peace and continue the legacy of preservation that the previous owners had maintained. What makes this situation even more interesting is the contrast between these two women. Victoria was all about control, appearances, and what she called curated living. She drove a brand-new Mercedes SUV, always wore designer suits, and seemed to appear out of nowhere whenever anyone in the community so much as changed a light bulb without approval. Rebecca, meanwhile, drove a modest hybrid car, worked in her garden, wearing old jeans and T-shirts, and had turned the property's old carriage house into a workshop where she restored vintage furniture as a hobby. She represented everything Victoria couldn't control, an independent homeowner who valued authenticity over appearances. The tension between these two different lifestyles was bound to come to a head eventually. But what's fascinating is how Victoria's obsession with control would ultimately lead to her downfall. She was so focused on maintaining her perfect community image that she couldn't stand the idea of this one property, this one person, existing outside her influence. And that's exactly what led to her next move, a move so brazen and illegal that it would not only destroy her carefully crafted image, but also expose the full extent of her activities to law enforcement. But before we get to that part, I want you to notice how Victoria's pattern of escalation had been building all along. Each action she took was more aggressive than the last, leading up to what would happen next. The first real sign that this situation was about to explode happened on a quiet Sunday morning in April. Rebecca was in her garden, tending to her spring plantings, when she noticed something strange. There were surveyor's stakes all along her private driveway. These weren't just any stakes. They were marked with the estates at Willow Creek's logos and had what appeared to be official county stamps on them. The strange thing was, Rebecca hadn't authorized any surveying on her property. In fact, she'd just had her own survey done when she purchased the house 6 months earlier. She took photos of the stakes and noticed something odd. The stamps, which looked official at first glance, were actually poorly made forgeries. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to make these look legitimate, but here's where it gets really interesting. While Rebecca was documenting the stakes, 3 men in what looked like official surveyor's uniforms approached her property. They were carrying professional equipment and had the estates at Willow Creek logos on their shirts. When Rebecca asked what they were doing, their response was shocking. "Ma'am, we're here to begin preliminary work for the community entrance redesign," one of them said, pulling out what looked like official paperwork. "According to our documents, this driveway is being incorporated into the estate's main entrance. Boulevard, we'll need you to relocate your vehicles within the next 48 hours. Rebecca immediately called the county planning office, only to discover that no permits had been filed for any work on her property. When she confronted the surveyors with this information, they seemed genuinely confused. It turned out Victoria had hired them through a shell company and provided them with what they thought were legitimate documents. This was just the beginning of Victoria's elaborate scheme. Over the next few weeks, Rebecca started noticing more and more strange occurrences. Her mail began disappearing, only to show up days later with "Return to Sender, not part of Willow Creek Estate" stamped on it. Her garbage collection suddenly stopped, with the company claiming they'd received documentation that her property was now part of a private community with its own waste management. But the most disturbing development was the appearance of what Rebecca started calling the HOA patrol. Victoria had hired a private security company, though, as we now know, their credentials were about as real as those surveyor stamps, to monitor the neighborhood. These guards, dressed in dark uniforms that deliberately mimicked police attire, began parking at the end of Rebecca's driveway. They started keeping detailed logs of everyone who came and went from Rebecca's property. Delivery drivers were stopped and questioned. Rebecca's friends were told they needed visitor passes to access her home. One guard even had the audacity to tell Rebecca's elderly mother that she was in violation of community guidelines because her car wasn't one of the approved colors for the estates. The situation reached a new level of absurdity when Victoria began installing community infrastructure on Rebecca's property without permission. It started small, a few landscaping lights along the driveway, some small signs with the estate's logo. But then came the security cameras, pointed directly at Rebecca's house, and a large "Welcome to the Estates at Willow Creek" sign installed right at the beginning of her private driveway. Each time Rebecca removed these items, they would mysteriously reappear within days. She started documenting everything, setting up her own security cameras and keeping detailed records of every interaction. Her home security footage from this period shows just how brazen Victoria's team had become. They would wait until late at night to reinstall signs and equipment, sometimes working under cover of darkness like some kind of HOA ninja squad. The breaking point came when Victoria decided to take her next major step. She began distributing glossy brochures to potential buyers that actually included Rebecca's driveway and parts of her property in the community plans. These brochures showed elaborate renderings of a grand entrance boulevard running right through Rebecca's property, complete with fountains, security gates, and a guardhouse. When Rebecca confronted Victoria about these brochures at the estate's sales office, Victoria's response was chilling. "Oh, don't worry about those plans," she said with a cold smile. "Everything has already been arranged. It's just a matter of time before your property becomes part of our community. Why fight the inevitable?" But Victoria had no idea that her next move, the one with the spike strips, would not only fail spectacularly, but would also expose her entire operation to law enforcement scrutiny. And thanks to Rebecca's foresight in documenting everything, what happened next would be caught entirely on camera. The first direct confrontation between Rebecca and Victoria happened on a Wednesday morning, and thankfully, Rebecca's security cameras caught the entire interaction. I've seen the footage and it's absolutely wild. Victoria showed up at Rebecca's house at exactly 8 a.m., driving her signature pearl-white Mercedes SUV, wearing what looked like a military-inspired blazer, complete with gold buttons and epaulettes. She had two of her fake security guards flanking, her like personal bodyguards. The security footage shows Victoria marching up Rebecca's driveway like she owned the place, her heels clicking on the pavement with military precision. She was carrying a leather portfolio stuffed with papers, and the expression on her face was pure determination. The security guards were trying their best to look intimidating, wearing those fake police-style uniforms and mirrored sunglasses. Rebecca was actually on a work video call when her doorbell camera alerted her to the visitors. She ended her call early and went to answer the door, making sure to start recording on her phone, a decision that would later prove crucial. The conversation that followed was something straight out of a movie. "Ms. Thompson," Victoria said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "I believe it's time we had a serious discussion about your property's integration into the estates at Willow Creek." She didn't wait for an invitation. She just stepped forward as if to enter the house. Rebecca stood her ground in the doorway. "Ms. Sterling, you're not welcome to enter my home. My property is not part of your development, and it never will be. I have the original deed and property maps to prove it." That's when Victoria's facade of politeness started to crack. She opened her portfolio and pulled out a stack of official-looking documents. "I'm afraid you're mistaken," she said, her voice taking on a harder edge. "You see these papers? These are the original development plans for this entire area, approved by the County Planning Commission. Your property falls within our designated expansion zone." Rebecca, keeping remarkably calm, pointed out something that would later become crucial evidence. "Those documents are dated 2023. My house was built in 1962. How exactly does that work?" Victoria's response was telling. She laughed. Not a genuine laugh, but one of those condescending chuckles that just drips with contempt. "Oh, sweetie," she said, "you really don't understand how things work around here, do you? The estates at Willow Creek is the future of this area. Your little historic property is simply an obstacle to progress. But don't worry. We've made arrangements to help you understand your position." That's when she signaled to one of her security guards, who pulled out what looked like an official citation book. "As of today," Victoria continued, "you are in violation of 17 different community guidelines. The fines total $24,500. Of course, these fines can be waived if you agree to sign over your property to the estate's management company." Rebecca's response was perfect. She calmly took out her phone and played a recording of her conversation with the county planning office from the previous day. In the recording, the office clearly stated that no development plans, including her property had ever been submitted or approved. Victoria's face in the security footage is priceless. You can literally see the moment she realizes her bluff has been called. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. Hard. "Listen carefully," Victoria said, dropping all pretense of politeness. "This property will become part of the estates, one way or another. I've invested too much in this development to let one stubborn homeowner ruin everything. You have until Friday to accept our offer, or things will become very uncomfortable for you." One of the security guards actually cracked his knuckles when she said this, like some cartoon thug. It would have been funny if it wasn't so clearly meant to be threatening. Rebecca's response was calm but firm. "Everything you've just said is on camera, Ms. Sterling, including your threat. Now please leave my property before I call the actual police." Victoria's parting words would later come back to haunt her in court. "The police? Honey, we are the authority here, and you're about to learn exactly what that means." As they left, Victoria paused at the end of the driveway and made a show of taking photos of Rebecca's house with her phone. She then turned and said loudly, "Enough for Rebecca's cameras to pick up. It would be a shame if something happened to your vehicle on this dangerous private road of yours. You really should let us install proper security measures." Little did Rebecca know at the time, but Victoria had already put her most dangerous plan into motion. The spike strips were already ordered and would be installed that very night, a decision that would ultimately lead to Victoria's arrest and the exposure of her entire operation. After that confrontation, things started escalating at an alarming rate. Victoria's tactics went from merely annoying to potentially dangerous, and it all happened within just 48 hours. First, Rebecca's internet suddenly went out. When she called her service provider, they told her they'd received paperwork indicating her property was being rezoned for community network access only. The document had apparently been signed by a community administrator. Then the real harassment began. Victoria's security team started setting up checkpoints, actual checkpoints, at both ends of Rebecca's private driveway. They put up these portable guard shacks that looked like they came straight from a surplus store, complete with boom gates and flashing yellow lights. The guards started demanding community access passes from anyone trying to visit Rebecca's house. This caused huge problems for Rebecca's work-from-home situation. She had an important client meeting scheduled, but the consultant she was meeting with was turned away by the guards, who claimed he was trespassing on private community property. Rebecca lost a significant contract because of this, which she later included in her lawsuit against Victoria. But Victoria's next move was even more outrageous. She hired a landscaping crew to begin community improvement work on Rebecca's property. Without permission, of course. Rebecca woke up one morning to find workers cutting down her historic rose bushes to make way for what they claimed was going to be the community standard landscaping package. When she tried to stop them, one of Victoria's security guards actually threatened to detain her for interfering with authorized community improvements. The landscapers had already destroyed about $15,000 worth of rare roses before Rebecca could get the real police to respond. But here's the crazy part. By the time the police arrived, Victoria's people had packed up and disappeared, taking all their equipment with them. They even took the destroyed rose bushes as evidence. The police officer who responded seemed skeptical of Rebecca's story until she showed him her security footage. That same week, Rebecca started noticing strange cars parking outside her house at night. Her security cameras caught Victoria's guards, taking photos of her house at all hours, documenting every time she left or returned home. They even started following her when she drove to the grocery store or went to meet friends. The intimidation tactics got more personal too. Victoria started hosting HOA meetings in a tent set up at the end of Rebecca's driveway. She would use a megaphone to discuss community violations and problem properties, making sure her voice carried all the way to Rebecca's house. During one of these meetings, which Rebecca recorded, Victoria actually said, "Some people think they can resist progress, but we have ways of dealing with obstacles to our community's vision." Rebecca's neighbors from the estates started leaving notes on her door, some sympathetic, warning her about Victoria's plans, others hostile, blaming her for their increasing HOA fees. Victoria had apparently told the residents that their dues had to go up because of legal fees related to community expansion resistance. Then came the utilities issues. Rebecca's water pressure mysteriously dropped to a trickle. Her mail started getting accidentally delivered to the estate's community center. Food deliveries were turned away, with drivers being told her address didn't exist. Even her garbage collection was interrupted because Victoria's team had told the company that her property was now part of a private waste management contract. But the most disturbing incident happened when Rebecca tried to leave for a doctor's appointment. She found her driveway blocked by 3 large landscaping trucks, strategically parked to prevent her from getting out. When she called the police, the trucks quickly disappeared, only to return the next day. This pattern continued for several days, with different vehicles blocking her driveway at random times. Victoria even went so far as to start advertising Rebecca's property as coming soon to the estates at Willow Creek. She put up a giant billboard right across from Rebecca's driveway, showing an artist's rendering of her property transformed into the development's grand entrance, complete with fountains and a guardhouse. The billboard read, "Future site of the estate's Grand Boulevard, historic obstacle removal in progress." The final straw came when Rebecca's home insurance company contacted her about a cancellation notice they'd received. Someone had submitted paperwork claiming her property was being incorporated into a managed community, and therefore her individual policy was being terminated. When Rebecca investigated, she found out that Victoria had actually tried to add her property to the estate's master insurance policy, without her knowledge or consent. All of this was building up to Victoria's master plan, the spike strip incident, that would finally push things too far. But what Victoria didn't realize was that Rebecca had been meticulously documenting everything, building a case that would ultimately lead to Victoria's downfall. And those security cameras Rebecca had installed, they were about to capture evidence of something that even Victoria's expensive lawyers couldn't explain away. The spike strip incident happened on a rainy Tuesday morning, and it was all caught on Rebecca's security cameras. She was heading out to an important client meeting, one she couldn't attend virtually because of her mysteriously interrupted internet service. The footage shows Rebecca's car starting down her driveway at exactly 7:42 a.m. That's when everything went horribly wrong. About halfway down the driveway, there was a sickening sound of metal tearing into rubber. Rebecca's car suddenly lurched to the side as all 4 tires were simultaneously shredded. The security footage clearly shows what happened next. Her car skidded on the wet pavement, barely missing a large oak tree before coming to a stop dangerously, close to a drainage ditch. But here's where it gets even more shocking. Within 2 minutes of Rebecca's car hitting the spike strips, Victoria's security team appeared out of nowhere, like they'd been waiting for this exact moment. They were driving one of those golf carts with the estate's security painted on the side. The footage shows them approaching Rebecca's car with what looked like pre-printed forms in their hands. The lead security guard, a man we'll call Steve, because his real name is part of an ongoing investigation, walked up to Rebecca's car with this smug grin on his face. "Looks like you've experienced some vehicle trouble," he said, his voice dripping with fake concern. "Fortunately, the estate's At Willow Creek offers premium roadside assistance for community members only. Rebecca, who thankfully wasn't injured in the incident, started recording on her phone as soon as she saw them approach. That's when they made their biggest mistake. Steve handed her a document titled Community Safety Enhancement Notice that would later become Exhibit A in the criminal case. This document, which I've actually seen a copy of, is absolutely incredible. It stated that due to repeated violations of community safety protocols, the estate's management had been forced to implement enhanced security measures. It went on to explain that the spike strips were a legally authorized traffic control device and that any damage to vehicles was the sole responsibility of non-compliant residents. But here's the kicker. The document included an offer. It stated that all security enhancement damages could be waived if Rebecca agreed to immediately sign her property over to the estate's management company. They literally tried to extort her right there, with her car still sitting on their illegal spike strips. The security footage shows Victoria arriving about 10 minutes later, wearing a bright red power suit and carrying what looked like a stack of papers. She walked up to Rebecca's car, looked at the damage, and actually had the audacity to say, "Well, this could have all been avoided if you'd just been reasonable about joining our community." What Victoria and her team didn't realize was that Rebecca wasn't alone in her car that morning. She had picked up her friend Lisa, a local news reporter, who was quietly filming the entire interaction on her professional camera. They had suspected something might happen after noticing suspicious activity on the driveway the night before. The footage shows Victoria becoming increasingly agitated as Rebecca refused to sign the papers. "This is your last chance," Victoria said, her voice rising. "Sign now or things will get much worse. We have more strips ready to install, and next time you might not be so lucky with your steering." That's when Lisa stepped out of the car, press badge clearly visible, and Victoria's face went pale. The security footage captures the exact moment Victoria realized she'd been caught. She immediately tried to backtrack, claiming it was all a community safety exercise and that the spike strips were just rubber training devices. But the evidence was already there. The real metal spike strips, the written extortion attempt, the security team's body language, and most importantly, Victoria's own words caught on multiple cameras. Within minutes, Rebecca had called both, the police and her lawyer. When the police arrived, Victoria tried to flee in her Mercedes. The officers had to chase her all the way to the estate's clubhouse, where she attempted to barricade herself in her office and was caught shredding documents. The responding officers would later testify that they found dozens of spike strips in a storage room, along with detailed plans showing where they were to be installed on other non-compliant properties in the area. This incident wasn't just the turning point in Rebecca's battle with Victoria, it was the beginning of the end for Victoria's entire operation. The spike strips weren't just illegal, they represented a clear attempt to cause bodily harm, and the subsequent extortion attempt elevated the whole thing to a criminal matter. But even as she was being led away in handcuffs, Victoria was still shouting about community standards and how she would make everyone comply. Little did Victoria know, but her arrest was just the beginning. What the police would discover during their investigation would shock even the most experienced detectives on the force. The police response to the spike strip incident was massive. Within an hour of Rebecca's call, her driveway looked like a scene from a crime show. There were 4 patrol cars, a crime scene unit, and even a bomb squad. They had to check if Victoria had installed any other surprises on the property. But the most interesting arrival was Detective Sarah Martinez, who specialized in real estate fraud cases. Detective Martinez took one look at the spike strips and immediately called the FBI. "This isn't just about property damage or harassment anymore," she explained to Rebecca. "The moment they combined these spike strips with written extortion demands, it became a federal crime. We're looking at attempted vehicular assault, extortion, mail fraud, and possible RICO violations. The investigation moved quickly. While the crime scene unit was photographing and collecting the spike strips, Detective Martinez interviewed Rebecca in her home. That's when they made their first shocking discovery. Remember all those official-looking documents Victoria had been waving around? Detective Martinez recognized the notary stamp on them. It belonged to a notary who had died 3 years ago. But here's where it gets really interesting. Rebecca's friend Lisa, the reporter, had connections at the county records office. She made a few calls and discovered something stunning. Victoria's entire development company, Willow Creek Estates, LLC, didn't legally exist. She had been operating under a fake business license, using forged documents, and collecting millions in HOA fees and property payments through what appeared to be a massive shell company scheme. The police brought in a forensic accountant who specialized in real estate fraud. Within hours, he had uncovered a web of fake companies, all leading back to Victoria. She hadn't just been trying to steal Rebecca's property. She had been running an elaborate real estate scam across multiple states. The estates at Willow Creek was just the latest and most ambitious version of her scheme. Rebecca's lawyer, Maria Chen, arrived during all this chaos. She took one look at the documentation and actually smiled. "This is beyond anything I've seen in 20 years of real estate law," she said. "They've managed to violate every major property law on the books, plus several federal statutes I didn't even know existed." The next few hours were intense. While the police continued their investigation, Maria helped Rebecca prepare emergency court filings. They needed to act fast because Victoria's arrest had created a panic among the estate's residents. People were suddenly realizing that the woman they'd trusted with their property and HOA fees might be a fraud. Maria and Rebecca worked together to document everything. They organized all of Rebecca's security footage, photographs, and recorded interactions with Victoria and her security team. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source: Victoria's own security guards. Steve, the head security guard who had tried to force Rebecca to sign the extortion documents, broke down during police questioning. He revealed that Victoria had an entire storage unit filled with fake documents, uniforms, and traffic control devices, including dozens more spike strips. He also admitted that Victoria had instructed them to target other homeowners in the area who had refused to sell their properties to the estates. By evening, the FBI had arrived and taken over the investigation. They brought in special equipment to scan Rebecca's entire property for other hidden devices. What they found was chilling. Victoria had installed hidden cameras in the trees along Rebecca's driveway, electronic tracking devices on her garbage, cans, and even a GPS tracker magnetically attached to her car's undercarriage. The FBI agent in charge, Agent Thompson, explained to Rebecca that they had actually been investigating Victoria for months. "Your case just gave us the smoking gun we needed," he said. "She's been running similar schemes in 3 other states, but this is the first time she's escalated to potentially deadly tactics." Maria helped Rebecca prepare for what would come next. They filed for emergency injunctions against the estate's HOA, restraining orders against Victoria and her entire security team, and began preparing a massive civil lawsuit. But Maria warned Rebecca that this was just the beginning. "Victoria's going to face criminal charges, but we need to make sure she can't hurt anyone else," Maria explained. "We're going to expose every aspect of her operation, every fake document, every illegal tactic. This isn't just about protecting your property anymore. It's about stopping her from doing this to other people." What nobody realized at that point was that Victoria had one more card to play. Even from her jail cell, she was already planning Her revenge and what would happen next would shock everyone involved in the case. Victoria might have been in jail, but that didn't stop her from causing chaos. Within 24 hours of her arrest, her high-powered attorney James Maxwell from the prestigious firm Maxwell and Associates held a press conference on the steps of the county courthouse. What he said was absolutely outrageous. "My client, Victoria Sterling, is the victim of a calculated scheme to destroy the estates at Willow Creek," Maxwell announced to the gathered reporters. The spike strips in question were legally purchased security devices installed on private community property for the protection of residents. Ms. Thompson trespassed on clearly marked community roads, making her solely responsible for any damage to her vehicle. But here's where it gets really interesting. While Maxwell was giving his press conference, Victoria was using her one phone call to contact someone named Alexander Wright, her mysterious business partner who nobody had ever seen. Within hours, Wright started executing what appeared to be their emergency contingency plan. First, all the residents of the estates received an emergency HOA notice claiming that their community was under attack from anti-development forces. The notice insisted that all homeowners immediately sign new contracts transferring their property rights to a newly formed LLC, supposedly to protect their investments. Several panicked residents actually signed these documents before the police could stop it. Then, Victoria's team launched what the FBI would later call a multimedia disinformation campaign. They created fake social media accounts, pretending to be estates residents, posting manufactured evidence that Rebecca was actually part of a rival development company trying to sabotage the estates. They even hired actors to pose as concerned residents for local news interviews. But the most shocking move came when Alexander Wright himself finally appeared. He showed up at the county recorder's office with a stack of documents that appeared to be from 1960, supposedly showing that Rebecca's entire property was actually part of a master-planned community development that predated her house. The documents looked incredibly authentic. They had aged paper, period-appropriate stamps, and even legitimate-looking signatures. Detective Martinez was immediately suspicious. "These documents are too perfect," she said after examining them. "Real documents from the 1960s show age variations, ink inconsistencies. These look like they were artificially aged all at once." She sent them to the FBI's forensic lab, but Victoria's team had already filed them with the court as evidence. The local media was having a field day with the story. Headlines were split between HOA president arrested in spike strip scandal and local homeowner accused of development sabotage. Victoria's PR team was working overtime, painting her as a visionary community developer being persecuted by anti-progress forces. Meanwhile, Victoria's security team, though officially disbanded, hadn't gone away. They just changed tactics. Instead of confronting Rebecca directly, they started approaching her neighbors, claiming they were private investigators gathering evidence of property fraud. They spread rumors that Rebecca's house was actually built on protected wetlands, and that environmental authorities were planning to condemn it. The pressure on Rebecca was intense. Her phone was ringing constantly with calls from reporters, angry estates residents, and even environmental activists who had been fed false information. Her email was flooded with fake cease and desist letters from non-existent law firms. Someone even hired a plane to fly over her house trailing a banner that read, "Stop the property fraud, support the estates." But Victoria's most devious move came through her corporate connections. She somehow managed to contact her friends in the banking industry, and suddenly Rebecca's mortgage company began reviewing her home loan. They claimed they had received concerning information about the property's legal status and were considering calling in the loan immediately. Maria Chen, Rebecca's lawyer, was furious. "This is textbook intimidation," she told Rebecca during an emergency meeting. "They're trying to force you to settle by attacking from every possible angle. But they've made one crucial mistake. Every single thing they're doing is documenting a pattern of harassment and conspiracy." The FBI was particularly interested in Alexander Wright. Agent Thompson's team discovered that Wright had been involved in similar schemes in other states, always appearing with convenient documents right when Victoria's projects faced legal troubles. But when they dug deeper into his background, they found something that would blow the case wide open. What they discovered about Wright would not only destroy Victoria's defense strategy, but would also expose a nationwide real estate fraud scheme that went far beyond spike strips and fake HOA documents. The first major break in the case came during an emergency hearing before Judge Eleanor Thompson. Victoria's lawyer, James Maxwell, had been confidently presenting their supposedly historic documents, arguing that Rebecca's property had always been part of the planned development. He was in the middle of his presentation when FBI agent Thompson walked into the courtroom and handed a folder to the prosecutor. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Just as Maxwell was pointing to the signatures on the 1960s documents, the prosecutor stood up. "Your Honor, we've just received the FBI forensic report on these documents. Would you like to know what they found in the paper?" The smug smile on Maxwell's face froze. It turned out the historic documents had been created using paper from a company that didn't even exist until 2020. The signatures had been copied from real 1960s documents in other county offices, but they'd used a modern scanner to do it. They even found metadata in some of the signature images showing they were scanned just 3 weeks ago. But here's where it gets really good. When confronted with this evidence, Alexander Wright, who had been sitting confidently in the gallery, suddenly got up and tried to leave the courtroom. Bad move. Agent Thompson was waiting by the door with handcuffs. Wright wasn't just Victoria's business partner. He was a known document forger wanted in 6 states for real estate fraud. The judge was livid. "In my 30 years on the bench," she said, "I have never seen such a blatant attempt to defraud this court." She immediately issued an injunction freezing all assets of the estates at Willow Creek and ordered a full investigation into every document Victoria's team had ever filed. The evidence started pouring in. Rebecca's lawyer, Maria Chen, presented the security footage of the spike strip incident, along with testimony from former security guards who had turned state's evidence. One by one, Victoria's schemes began to unravel. The forensic accountants discovered that Victoria and Wright had been running similar scams across the country. They would build luxury developments, create fake HOAs with outrageous rules, and then use those rules to force nearby property owners to sell at a loss. The spike strips were new, though. That was Victoria's special escalation just for Rebecca. Judge Thompson's ruling was devastating for Victoria's operation. Not only did she throw out every single claim against Rebecca's property, but she also ordered Victoria's team to pay Rebecca's legal fees and issued a preliminary judgment of $500,000 in damages for the spike strip incident alone. But the most satisfying moment came when the judge addressed Victoria directly via video link from the jail. "Ms. Sterling, your actions show a complete disregard for both the law and basic human safety. You turned a simple property dispute into a potentially lethal situation. This court has no choice but to refer this matter for criminal prosecution." Victoria's response was telling. She actually started laughing. "You don't understand," she said through the video feed. "This is bigger than all of you. We have developments like this all over the country. You can't stop progress." The judge immediately muted her feed and ordered her held without bail. The aftermath of the hearing was chaos. News crews had gathered outside the courthouse, and when Maria Chen emerged with Rebecca, the reporters swarmed them. That's when Rebecca gave a statement that would go viral. "This isn't just about my property anymore. This is about standing up to bullies who think they can use fake rules and real violence to get their way. The FBI's investigation revealed just how right Rebecca was. They found evidence of similar spike strip purchases in 3 other states, where Victoria and Wright had developments. They had literally been planning to use the same tactics on other homeowners who refused to sell. But perhaps the most satisfying victory came from the estate's residents themselves. Once the truth about Victoria's schemes became public, they held an emergency meeting and voted to dissolve the HOA completely. They then elected a new community council, and their first act was to formally apologize to Rebecca and offer to help restore her damaged property. The local media, which had initially been somewhat sympathetic to Victoria's side, completely changed their tune. The Channel 5 investigative team ran a special report titled HOA Horror, the Spike Strip Scandal, that would later win a regional Emmy Award. They used Rebecca's security footage to show exactly how Victoria's team had installed the spike strips. Under cover of darkness, this first victory was crucial, but everyone knew it was just the beginning. Victoria still faced criminal charges, and the FBI's investigation into her nationwide operation was just getting started. But for the first time since this whole nightmare began, Rebecca could drive down her own driveway without fear, though she still had her lawyer's team check for spike strips every morning just to be safe. After the first court victory, Rebecca's legal team didn't waste any time. They gathered in Maria Chen's office for what would become a crucial strategy session. The FBI had discovered something disturbing. Victoria and Wright's operation went far beyond just the estates at Willow Creek. They had similar developments in 12 different states, and the spike strip tactic was just the tip of the iceberg. Agent Thompson spread out a map across Maria's conference table. Red pins marked every location where Victoria and Wright had developments. These aren't just random locations, he explained. They specifically targeted areas with historic properties or long-term homeowners who wouldn't want to sell. Then, they'd build their developments around them and start the pressure campaign. Maria pulled up the financial records they'd obtained through the court order. "Look at this pattern," she said, pointing to a series of transactions. Every time they failed to force someone out through their fake HOA rules, they'd create a new shell company. Then suddenly, that homeowner would start having mysterious problems, damaged vehicles, vandalism, utility interruptions. But here's where it gets really interesting. Rebecca noticed something in the financial records that even the FBI had missed. She pointed to a series of payments made to a company called Community Security Solutions. These payment amounts match exactly what Victoria's team quoted me for their security enhancement devices, the spike strips. They've been buying them in bulk. The FBI cybercrimes unit got involved when they discovered Victoria had set up an entire network of fake websites. These sites appeared to be legitimate government offices, HOA certification boards, and property management companies. They were all designed to make her developments look officially sanctioned. Detective Martinez brought in records from other jurisdictions. "We've found at least 15 other homeowners who experienced similar harassment," she explained. But Victoria was careful. She never used the same exact tactics twice, and she always had Wright create documents that made it look legal. The team decided they needed to approach this like a RICO case, going after Victoria's entire organization as a criminal enterprise. But they knew Victoria wouldn't go down easily. Even from jail, she was still pulling strings through her network of corrupt officials and fake security companies. Rebecca's role would be crucial. As the only victim with comprehensive video evidence and documentation, she would be the star witness. But this also made her a target. The team decided to install a state-of-the-art security system at her house, complete with panic buttons and direct lines to law enforcement. "We need to be prepared for anything," Maria warned. "Victoria's facing serious prison time now. She's got nothing left to lose." She wasn't wrong. They soon discovered that Victoria had been making calls from jail to someone named the Consultant, who specialized in problem resolution for desperate real estate developers. The FBI set up a task force specifically for the case. They codenamed it Operation Spike Strip. Agent Thompson had a sense of humor about it. They brought in forensic accountants, document experts, and even a former HOA scammer who agreed to consult in exchange for leniency in his own case. The plan they developed was comprehensive. First, they would use Rebecca's case to establish the pattern of criminal behavior. Then, they would coordinate with law enforcement in other states to raid Victoria's development simultaneously, gathering evidence before her associates could destroy it. But they had to move carefully. Victoria had connections in some local governments, and they discovered that several planning office employees had been on her payroll. They couldn't risk tipping off anyone who might warn her network. Rebecca suggested something brilliant, using Victoria's own surveillance tactics against her organization. "She's got cameras everywhere in her developments," Rebecca pointed out. "And legally, since she installed them, we should have access to all that footage." The FBI loved this idea. They could use Victoria's own security systems to gather evidence of her crimes. Maria Chen worked with prosecutors to prepare for what would likely be a complex trial. They created a timeline of every incident, from the first fake HOA notices to the spike strip attack. They also prepared for Victoria's likely defenses. She had already tried claiming that Rebecca was part of a competitor's scheme to destroy her business. The team also had to prepare for public reaction. Victoria had supporters among wealthy developers who saw her as a visionary rather than a criminal. Some even tried to paint her as a victim of anti-development activism. The PR battle would be almost as important as the legal one, but the most crucial part of their strategy involved protecting other potential victims. They identified several properties in Victoria's other developments that showed signs of similar harassment patterns. These homeowners would need to be warned and protected before Victoria's organization could escalate to spike strips or worse. The FBI launched Operation Spike Strip at exactly 6 a.m. on a Thursday morning. It was a massive, coordinated effort across 12 states, with over 200 agents simultaneously raiding Victoria's developments, offices, and storage facilities. The timing was crucial. They needed to catch Victoria's associates before they could destroy any evidence. At the estates at Willow Creek, the raid was particularly dramatic. FBI agents discovered a hidden room in the community center's basement, accessed through a fake wall panel. Inside, they found what Agent Thompson called a fraud factory. Industrial printers, specially designed for creating fake documents, stamps from various government offices, and even a machine for artificially aging paper. But the real goldmine was Victoria's private office computer. Despite her attempts to delete files remotely from jail, the FBI cyber team recovered thousands of emails and documents. They found detailed plans for what Victoria called Operation Community Integration, a systematic approach to forcing homeowners to sell their properties through escalating harassment. The spike strips were just phase one of her plan. Phase 2 involved something even more sinister. She had ordered what she called technical interference devices that could selectively disrupt utilities to specific homes. The FBI found invoices for equipment that could remotely cut power, interfere with internet signals, and even tamper with water pressure. Meanwhile, Rebecca played her part perfectly. She agreed to be interviewed by local news stations, sharing her security footage and documentation. Her story inspired other victims to come forward. Within days, the FBI had collected testimonies from over 30 homeowners who had experienced similar harassment from Victoria's organization. The investigation revealed that Alexander Wright wasn't just a document forger. He was a former city planner who had access to official records across multiple states. He'd been using this knowledge to create incredibly convincing fake documents, making it appear that Victoria's developments had legal authority over neighboring properties. One of the most shocking discoveries came from Victoria's email archives. They found messages to someone called the architect, who had actually designed the spike strips specifically for Victoria's operations. These weren't ordinary traffic control devices. They were engineered to cause maximum damage while appearing to be legitimate security equipment. The FBI's forensic accountants followed the money trail and uncovered a network of shell companies that made Victoria's operation look like a Russian nesting doll of fraud. Each development was connected to multiple fake companies, all designed to hide the true ownership and make it nearly impossible for victims to figure out who was really behind their harassment. Detective Martinez's investigation of the local angle paid off too. They discovered that Victoria had bribed several county employees to lose original property records and replace them with Wright's forged versions. 2 planning office employees were arrested, and their cooperation led to even more evidence against Victoria's organization. But perhaps the most satisfying breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Victoria's own security team. Once they realized they were facing criminal charges for their role in the spike strip incident, they started talking. The head of security, Steve, provided detailed testimony about Victoria's direct orders to install the spike strips and her specific instructions to make it look like an accident. The FBI set up a tip line for potential victims, and the response was overwhelming. They received over 100 calls in the first week alone. Each story followed a similar pattern: a historic or valuable property surrounded by one of Victoria's developments, followed by escalating harassment and fraudulent legal claims. Rebecca's lawyer, Maria Chen, worked with prosecutors to organize all the evidence into a coherent narrative. They created a timeline showing how Victoria's tactics had evolved from simple harassment to potentially deadly force. The spike strips weren't an isolated incident. They were the latest escalation in a pattern of increasingly dangerous behavior. The investigation also revealed something that made everyone's blood run cold. Victoria had been planning to expand her operation. They found proposals for 20 new developments, each targeting areas with historic properties or resistant homeowners. The spike strips were just the beginning. She had plans for even more aggressive compliance measures. As the evidence mounted, Victoria's remaining supporters began to distance themselves. The luxury home builders who had once praised her vision now couldn't run away fast enough. Even her high-powered attorney, James Maxwell, filed a motion to withdraw from her case, citing irreconcilable differences with his client. But Victoria wasn't done yet. Even as her empire crumbled around her, she was working on one last desperate plan, one that would put Rebecca and the entire investigation team in serious danger. Victoria's final move came just 3 days before her criminal trial was set to begin. Using her one remaining loyal associate, a former tech company executive named Marcus Hansen, she orchestrated what the FBI would later call the desperate last stand of a cornered fraudster. It started when Rebecca received an urgent call from her bank. Someone claiming to be from the county assessor's office had filed paperwork claiming her property was actually owned by a company called Heritage Holdings LLC. The documentation looked perfect. It even included historical records showing that Rebecca's house had been built on land originally owned by this mysterious company. But this time, Rebecca was ready. She immediately contacted Agent Thompson, who had been expecting something like this. "Victoria's predictable," he said. "She always goes back to forged documents when she's desperate." The FBI quickly traced Heritage Holdings LLC back to Marcus Hansen, and that's when they discovered Victoria's endgame. Hansen had set up a sophisticated operation to transfer ownership of not just Rebecca's property, but dozens of other homes that had resisted Victoria's developments. The plan was to create such a tangled web of false ownership claims that it would take years to sort out in court. Meanwhile, Victoria would use the confusion to argue that she couldn't be prosecuted until the property ownership issues were resolved. What Victoria didn't know was that the FBI had been monitoring Hansen's activities ever since they found his name in her jail phone records. They watched as he set up fake offices, created backdated documents, and tried to bribe county officials. Every move he made was documented, adding to the evidence against Victoria. The climax came when Hansen attempted to physically take possession of Rebecca's property. He showed up with a moving truck and what appeared to be court orders, authorizing him to reclaim the property for Heritage Holdings. But Rebecca was prepared. She had installed new security cameras that live-streamed directly to the FBI office, and Agent Thompson's team was waiting. The footage of Hansen's arrest would later go viral. As he waved his fake court orders and demanded entry to Rebecca's house, FBI agents emerged from hidden positions all around the property. Hansen tried to run but didn't get far. He tripped over one of his own moving boxes and face-planted right in front of the news cameras that had gathered to document the incident. The evidence found in Hansen's possession was damning. He had detailed instructions from Victoria, written in code but easily deciphered by FBI cryptographers. The instructions revealed not just the property theft scheme, but also plans to discredit Rebecca and the investigation team through a sophisticated disinformation campaign. Victoria's reaction to Hansen's arrest was caught on jail security cameras. When she saw the news report, she completely lost it. She started ranting about how she was the victim of a vast conspiracy, claiming that Rebecca was actually part of a secret organization trying to destroy legitimate business people like herself. The district attorney used Victoria's meltdown to argue that she was a continuing threat and should be held in maximum security until her trial. The judge agreed, especially after hearing about the Heritage Holdings scheme. Victoria was transferred to a higher security facility, effectively ending her ability to communicate with any remaining associates. Rebecca's property was finally legally secured. The FBI worked with county officials to put special notices on the deeds of all properties targeted by Victoria's organization, preventing any future ownership fraud attempts. They also set up a task force to help other victims clear their titles and remove any fraudulent claims. The estates at Willow Creek underwent a complete transformation. The remaining residents voted to convert it into a normal subdivision without an HOA. They removed all of Victoria's ridiculous rules and restrictions, took down the security cameras she had installed, and even held a community celebration where they ceremonially destroyed the last remaining spike strips found on the property. Rebecca's story became a case study in fighting HOA fraud. Law schools started using it in their real estate law courses, and several states passed new laws specifically addressing HOA overreach and fraud. These became known as Sterling Laws, though not in honor of Victoria, but as a warning about the tactics she had used. The FBI's final report on Victoria's operation was staggering. They documented over $50 million in fraud across multiple states, hundreds of victims, and a network of corruption that reached into local governments and planning offices. The Spike Strip incident, which had started it all, was just one small part of a massive criminal enterprise. But perhaps the most satisfying resolution came from the actual homeowners. All across the country, people who had been terrorized by Victoria's organization began reclaiming their properties and their peace of mind. Communities that had been torn apart by her schemes came together, forming support groups and helping each other recover from the trauma of her harassment. Now, let's look at some of the reactions to this story, because they really show how this case affected people across the country. The original Reddit post where Rebecca first shared her experience went viral, getting over 100,000 upvotes and thousands of comments. I want to share some of the most impactful responses with you. User Homeowner Hero wrote, "As someone who experienced similar HOA harassment, though thankfully without spike strips, this story gives me hope. Victoria's arrest sends a message. To every power-hungry HOA president out there, there are limits to your authority, and crossing them has consequences." Rebecca isn't just a homeowner who stood her ground. She's a hero who helped expose a nationwide criminal enterprise. The fact that she documented everything and worked with law enforcement instead of taking matters into her own hands shows incredible restraint and wisdom. This comment got over 20,000 upvotes, and it sparked a whole discussion about HOA abuse across the country. People started sharing their own stories, and a pattern emerged. Many HOAs had been trying similar tactics, though none had gone quite as far as Victoria with the spike strips. Another powerful comment came from Legal Eagle 123, who identified themselves as a real estate attorney. "I've been practicing property law for 25 years, and this case is a game changer. The thoroughness of Rebecca's documentation, combined with the FBI's investigation, has created a legal precedent that will help protect homeowners for years to come. The sterling laws being passed in various states are long overdue. HOAs serve a purpose, but they were never meant to have the kind of power Victoria tried to claim. This case will be taught in law schools as an example of how property rights can be defended against organizational overreach. But perhaps the most touching responses came from residents of the estates at Willow Creek themselves. Former resident Sarah Martinez commented, "We all bought into Victoria's vision of an exclusive community, but we had no idea what she was doing to people like Rebecca. The spike strips were a wake-up call for all of us. When we found out about her larger criminal enterprise, we were horrified. Many of us had been pressured into supporting her harassment campaigns through threats and manipulation. Rebecca didn't just save her own property, she saved our community from becoming part of a criminal operation." The story also sparked discussions about property rights and community governance. User Property Protector wrote, "What makes this case so important is how it exposes the vulnerability of property rights in modern America. Victoria's scheme worked for so long because she exploited gaps in oversight and enforcement. The spike strip incident was just the visible part of a much larger problem. Rebecca's stand against this abuse has helped create new protections for all homeowners. Local news coverage generated its own wave of supportive comments. On Channel 5's website, their investigative report received hundreds of responses. One particularly insightful comment came from a former city planner. "What Victoria tried to do with those spike strips wasn't just criminal. It was a perversion of everything community development should be about. Real community development brings people together. It doesn't use violence and intimidation to force people out." Rebecca's case has already influenced how we review development proposals and HOA regulations. The support wasn't just online. People started showing up at Rebecca's property to offer help. Local contractors volunteered to repair damage caused by Victoria's harassment. Landscapers offered to restore her gardens. Even local law students organized volunteer groups to help other victims of HOA fraud navigate the legal system. One comment that really captured the community's sentiment came from Neighbor in Need. "This isn't just about one homeowner fighting back against an HOA gone mad. This is about standing up to systematic abuse of power." The spike strips were shocking, but they were just a symptom of a larger disease, the idea that money and power give you the right to bully others into submission. Rebecca showed us that one person, armed with truth and determination, can stand up to even the most elaborate criminal enterprise, and win. The story also inspired practical action. Property rights groups started creating educational resources about HOA fraud. Security companies began offering specialized systems to protect against similar harassment tactics. Legal aid organizations developed programs specifically for helping homeowners fight fraudulent property claims. Even international readers weighed in. A comment from Aussie Observer noted, "From halfway around the world, this story reads like a thriller, but it highlights universal themes about property rights and abuse of power." The spike strips might be a uniquely American escalation, but the underlying issue, powerful entities trying to bully individuals, is something we all recognize. Rebecca's victory is inspiring for property owners everywhere. Now, not everyone viewed this situation the same way, and I think it's important to look at some of the different perspectives that emerged. While most people supported Rebecca, there were some interesting counter-arguments and debates that came up in the aftermath of the case. One controversial comment came from Developer Insider, who wrote, "While I absolutely condemn the spike strips and illegal activities, we need to acknowledge that uncontrolled property development can destroy community value." Victoria's methods were criminal, but her basic concept of maintaining community standards isn't wrong. Rebecca's victory could make it harder for legitimate HOAs to enforce necessary regulations. This comment sparked a heated debate, with user Property Rights Frawl responding, "That's exactly the kind of thinking that enables HOA abuse." There's a massive difference between maintaining community standards and installing spike strips to force compliance. Victoria wasn't protecting property values. She was running a criminal enterprise disguised as community development. Another interesting perspective came from HOA President Jane, who identified herself as a current HOA president. "This case has made our job much harder. Every time we try to enforce legitimate rules, homeowners bring up the Sterling case and accuse us of harassment." While Victoria was clearly criminal, the backlash is affecting HOAs that actually follow the law and serve their communities properly. Local business owners also weighed in. Marcus Chen, owner of a real estate agency near the estates, commented, "Victoria's scheme has damaged property values, but not in the way she claimed it would. Her actions have created a stigma around planned communities in our area. We're seeing buyers specifically asking for homes that aren't part of an HOA." The spike strip incident scared people away from community governance entirely. Some residents of Victoria's other developments across the country shared their experiences. Desert Dweller wrote, "We didn't have spike strips in our community, but we experienced similar harassment. Victoria's team tried to force us to sell our historic adobe home because it didn't match their aesthetic guidelines. They cut our water lines and claimed it was infrastructure maintenance." Rebecca's case helped us understand we weren't alone. However, Community Planner offered a more nuanced view. The real tragedy here is how Victoria poisoned the concept of planned community development. When done properly, HOAs can genuinely benefit homeowners and maintain neighborhood quality. The spike strips and fraud represent a criminal perversion of what should be a tool for community cooperation. Legal experts debated the broader implications. Professor Sarah Thompson from State University's Law School commented, "The Sterling case exposes gaps in HOA oversight that need addressing. While the spike strips were obviously criminal, many of Victoria's other tactics operated in legal grey areas. We need better regulations to prevent HOA overreach before it escalates to physical threats." Some criticized Rebecca's approach. User Mediate First argued, "While Victoria was clearly wrong, Rebecca could have tried harder to find a diplomatic solution. Taking everything to court and involving the FBI has created a precedent of escalation that might encourage other homeowners to bypass mediation options. This prompted a strong response from security expert. Diplomatic solution with Spike. Strips, there's a time for mediation and a time to call the FBI. When someone deliberately creates a potentially lethal hazard on your property, diplomacy is off the table. Even some former HOA board members who had worked with Victoria shared their perspectives. Former board member wrote, "Looking back, there were red flags we ignored." Victoria always talked about community compliance rather than community building. She saw homeowners as obstacles rather than neighbors. The spike strips were just the physical manifestation of her hostile approach to community management. Environmental groups added another dimension to the debate. Greenspace advocate commented, "While Victoria's methods were criminal, she was right about one thing. Uncontrolled property development can harm communities." However, the solution isn't spike strips and fraud. It's proper zoning laws and environmental regulations. Real estate developers worried about industry implications. James Morgan, CEO of a regional development company, stated, "Victoria's crimes have made it harder for legitimate developers to work with communities. We are seeing increased suspicion and resistance to any form of organized community development. It will take years to rebuild trust." The debate even reached academic circles, with urban planning students using the case as a study in how not to manage community development. Professor Michael Chang of Urban Studies noted, "The spike strip incident represents the ultimate failure of community governance when enforcement becomes violence. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of maintaining democratic principles in community management." After covering HOA stories for years, I have to say this case really stands out, and not just because of the spike strips. What makes it particularly significant is how it exposed a type of property fraud that had been happening right under everyone's noses. Let me break down why this case is so important and what it means for homeowners everywhere. First, let's talk about what made Victoria's scheme different from typical HOA abuse. Most HOA horror stories involve power-hungry board members or excessive rule enforcement, but Victoria took it to a whole new level by creating an entire fake security apparatus. Those spike strips weren't just dangerous, they represented a fundamental shift from bureaucratic harassment to physical violence. I've interviewed dozens of victims of HOA abuse over the years, but what Victoria did was unprecedented. She didn't just try to force compliance through fines or threats. She literally created a private army of fake security officers and installed potentially lethal devices on private property. This wasn't just about controlling property appearance anymore. It was about using fear and violence to force people out of their homes. What's particularly chilling is how close she came to getting away with it. If Rebecca hadn't installed those security cameras, if she hadn't documented everything so carefully, this could have ended very differently. Victoria's organization was sophisticated enough to fool local officials, banks, and even some law enforcement officers. They had perfected the art of making illegal actions look legitimate. The spike strip incident wasn't just an escalation, it was a mistake that exposed the true nature of these development schemes. Victoria had successfully used less visible forms of harassment in other communities, but the physical evidence of the spike strips gave investigators something concrete to work with. You can't explain away spike strips as a community safety measure when they're clearly designed to cause damage. I've spent time reviewing the FBI's case files, the ones that have been made public. And what's fascinating is how Victoria's organization operated like a well-oiled machine. They had different teams for different types of harassment, document forgers, fake security personnel, even PR specialists who would smear resistant homeowners in local media. The spike strips were just one tool in a massive toolbox of intimidation tactics. One thing that really stands out to me is how this case has changed the way we look at property rights. Before this, most people thought of HOA abuse as a civil matter, something to be handled in local courts. But Victoria's spike strip scheme showed that these situations can cross into serious criminal territory. It's not just about property values anymore. It's about protecting people from organized criminal enterprises that use real estate development as a cover. I've talked with legal experts who say this case has created a new framework for prosecuting HOA fraud. Before, it was difficult to prove criminal intent in these situations. But Victoria's spike strips provided a clear example of how HOA harassment can escalate to criminal behavior. This has made it easier for prosecutors to take these cases seriously. The impact on the real estate development industry has been significant too. I've spoken with several legitimate developers who say they're now much more careful about how they handle community relations. The Sterling laws being passed in various states aren't just about preventing spike strips, they're about creating better oversight of how developments interact with existing communities. What really gets me about this case is how it revealed the vulnerability of individual homeowners. Rebecca wasn't some naive newcomer. She was a sophisticated professional who did everything right. She had her documentation in order, she knew her rights, and she still almost lost her property to this scheme. It makes you wonder how many other people have been forced out of their homes by similar tactics that weren't quite as obvious as spike strips. The aftermath of this case has been fascinating to watch. I've been tracking similar cases across the country, and we're seeing a real change in how these situations are handled. Law enforcement is more willing to investigate HOA complaints, courts are more skeptical of HOA claims, and homeowners are more aware of their rights. But here's what really keeps me up at night. Victoria's operation wasn't unique. The FBI investigation revealed similar schemes operating in other parts of the country. They might not be using spike strips, but they're using the same basic playbook. Create a legitimate-looking development, surround existing properties, and then use escalating harassment to force people out. This is why I think Rebecca's story is so important. It's not just about one homeowner standing up to an HOA gone mad. It's about exposing a type of organized crime that operates behind a facade of legitimate business. The spike strips were shocking, but they were just the visible part of a much larger problem. I've been following property rights cases for a long time, but this one changed how I view community development entirely. It showed that we need to be vigilant not just about obvious threats to property rights, but about sophisticated schemes that use legitimate-looking structures to commit fraud. Now, while the FBI was investigating Victoria's operation, they uncovered something even more disturbing. Remember Marcus Hansen, Victoria's last loyal associate? Well, his arrest led investigators to another development company called Premium Communities Inc., operating in the next state over. And what they found there made the spike strips look almost tame by comparison. Premium Communities was run by a former business partner of Victoria's named Thomas Blackwood. Like Victoria, he specialized in building luxury developments around existing properties. But his tactics were even more aggressive. Instead of spike strips, his organization was using what they called environmental modification techniques to force people out of their homes. The FBI discovered that Blackwood's team had installed underground pumps near targeted properties to deliberately alter the water table. They would cause minor flooding in basements, create sinkholes in yards, and then have their engineering consultants declare the properties unsafe. When homeowners tried to fix these issues, they'd mysteriously find that no local contractors were willing to take on the work. One particularly egregious case involved an elderly couple, the Hendersons, who had lived in their home for over 40 years. Blackwood's team had actually installed remote-controlled sprinkler systems on adjacent properties that would activate at night, slowly undermining the Hendersons' foundation. Then they'd have their safety inspectors show up. Coincidentally, right after major damage occurred, Agent Thompson, who had led the investigation into Victoria's spike strips, was assigned to the Blackwood case as well. "It's like looking at an evolution of Victoria's tactics," he explained. "They learned from her mistakes. Instead of leaving obvious evidence like spike strips, they created natural disasters that were nearly impossible to trace back to them." The connection between Victoria and Blackwood went deeper than anyone initially suspected. Investigators found emails showing they had actually developed their tactics together, testing different methods in various communities to see what worked best. Victoria had chosen more direct intimidation with her security teams and spike strips, while Blackwood preferred what he called environmental persuasion. But here's where it gets really interesting. When the FBI raided Blackwood's offices, they found a manual, literally a printed guidebook, titled Community Integration Strategies. This book detailed dozens of methods for forcing resistant homeowners to sell, ranging from simple harassment to elaborate schemes involving fake environmental hazards. The spike strip strategy was actually listed in there as a last resort tactic. The manual had been distributed to development companies across the country. Investigators identified at least 15 other organizations using these techniques. Each one had adapted the basic strategy to their local situation, but they all followed the same pattern: surround target properties, create problems that seemed unrelated to the development, and then offer to solve these problems by purchasing the properties at below market rates. One company in Florida had created artificial sinkholes. Another in Texas had manipulated local water pressure to cause plumbing disasters. A group in Oregon had even engineered minor landslides to make properties appear unstable. The spike strips that had exposed Victoria's operation were just one tool in a nationwide arsenal of property fraud techniques. Rebecca's security camera footage became crucial evidence in these wider investigations. Her documentation of Victoria's escalating tactics helped investigators identify similar patterns in other communities. They could show how these companies started with simple harassment and gradually escalated to more dangerous methods. The investigation revealed a network of corrupt officials who had been helping these operations. Building inspectors, code enforcement officers, and even some local police had been paid to look the other way or actively assist in these schemes. The spike strip incident had cracked open what one FBI agent called a nationwide conspiracy of property fraud. Blackwood's arrest was even more dramatic than Victoria's. When federal agents arrived at his office, they found him feeding documents into an industrial shredder. But just like Victoria, he had underestimated modern forensics. The FBI's tech team was able to reconstruct most of the shredded documents, adding even more evidence to the case. The discovery of this larger network helped explain why Victoria had seemed so confident even after her arrest. She knew she wasn't alone. She was part of an organized network of development companies using similar tactics. The spike strips that had exposed her operation were just the tip of a very large iceberg. As investigators dug deeper, they found evidence of these schemes going back over a decade. Hundreds of homeowners had been forced out of their properties through various forms of harassment and manufactured disasters. The total value of properties fraudulently acquired through these methods was estimated at over $500 million. The investigation into this nationwide property fraud scheme hit a critical point when the FBI discovered something that changed everything. Among the files recovered from Blackwood's shredded documents was a list of upcoming community integration projects scheduled for the next year. These weren't just plans. They were already in motion, with deposits paid and shell companies established. What made this discovery particularly urgent was that some of these projects made Victoria's spike strips look amateur by comparison. One development company in Colorado had already purchased industrial-grade sound equipment, planning to use infrasound waves to make targeted homes literally uninhabitable. Another group in Arizona had begun installing hidden chemical sprayers designed to create artificial mold problems in specific houses. Agent Thompson immediately organized a task force to prevent these planned attacks. "We're not just investigating past crimes anymore," he explained during an emergency briefing. "We're literally racing against time to stop these companies before they can harm more homeowners." The pressure intensified when Rebecca received an anonymous email containing blueprints for something called Project Displacement. The plans showed sophisticated methods for undermining house foundations, manipulating utility systems, and creating what they called engineered natural disasters. These weren't just harassment tactics, they were potentially lethal weapons disguised as property development tools. The FBI traced the email back to a former employee of Victoria's company who had grown concerned about the escalating violence of these schemes. This whistleblower, whom we'll call Alex to protect their identity, revealed that Victoria and Blackwood had been part of a larger organization called the Community Development Alliance, or CDA. The CDA, it turned out, was essentially a criminal training network disguised as a professional association. They held seminars teaching developers how to use these tactics, shared resources for creating fake documents, and even maintained a database of corrupt officials willing to assist in their schemes. The spike strips that had exposed Victoria's operation were actually showcased at one of their conferences as an innovative compliance tool. What really alarmed investigators was the discovery of the CDA's Research and Development Division. They had been systematically testing new methods of property harassment, keeping detailed records of what worked best in different situations. They had categorized their tactics into levels, with spike strips classified as a Level 3 intervention. The plans found in Blackwood's files included Level 4 and Level 5 tactics that hadn't been deployed yet. Rebecca's lawyer, Maria Chen, worked with the FBI to analyze these documents. "They've turned property fraud into a science," she said, reviewing the materials. "Each tactic is carefully designed to appear accidental or unrelated to the development company. The spike strips were actually a mistake. They were too obvious, too easy to trace back to the source." The investigation revealed that the CDA had infiltrated local governments across the country. They had people in planning offices, tax assessors' offices, and even law enforcement. These corrupt officials would help create the appearance of legitimacy for their schemes, making it nearly impossible for victims to fight back through normal legal channels. One particularly disturbing discovery was a CDA training manual that detailed how to psychologically break down resistant homeowners. They had studied which tactics caused the most stress, how long people typically held out before giving up, and even how to manipulate property values to prevent victims from being able to sell to anyone else. The FBI's Cybercrimes Unit uncovered encrypted communication network the CDA used to coordinate their activities. The messages they recovered showed just how organized this conspiracy was. Different development companies would share resources, warn each other about investigations, and even trade tactics that had proven successful. As the investigation expanded, more victims started coming forward. The FBI set up a special hotline just for cases related to the CDA, and it was flooded with calls. People who had lost their homes years ago suddenly realized they hadn't been alone. They'd been targeted by a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The pressure on the investigation team was intense. They knew that for every development project they identified, there were probably others they hadn't found yet. The CDA had been operating for years, carefully covering their tracks and destroying evidence of their activities. Rebecca's case became crucial because it was one of the few times they'd left physical evidence. The spike strips, while crude compared to their other tactics, provided a direct link between the harassment and the development company. This evidence helped prosecutors build cases against other CDA members who had been more careful about hiding their involvement. The investigation also revealed that the CDA had contingency plans in case they were discovered. They had set up elaborate networks of shell companies, prepared false evidence to discredit potential whistleblowers, and even established offshore accounts to hide their profits. Taking down this organization wouldn't be as simple as making a few arrests. The final takedown of the Community Development Alliance happened on a scale that nobody had expected. The FBI coordinated with law enforcement agencies across 23 states for what they called Operation Property Rights. At exactly 6 a.m. Eastern Time, teams of agents simultaneously raided over 50 development offices, multiple private residences, and even several local government buildings. The timing was crucial because they had discovered that the CDA had a dead man's switch. If any one operation was raided, the others would immediately begin destroying evidence. By hitting them all at once, they prevented anyone from alerting the others. The FBI had actually cut internet service to several key locations just before the raids to prevent any warning messages from going out. Victoria, watching from her jail cell, finally realized the game was up. When agents showed her the evidence they'd gathered about the entire organization, she made a decision that would shake the real estate development world. She agreed to testify against the CDA's leadership in exchange for consideration in her sentencing. Her testimony was devastating. She revealed names, dates, locations, everything about how the organization operated. She explained how they'd select their targets, how they'd infiltrate local governments, and how they'd systematically force people out of their homes. The spike strips that had started this whole investigation, she revealed, were actually considered crude by CDA standards. The spike strips were a mistake, she admitted in her testimony. We were supposed to use more subtle methods, but I got impatient with Rebecca's resistance. I thought a direct approach would work faster. That decision brought down our entire organization. The evidence collected in the raids was staggering. Agents found detailed plans for future operations, lists of corrupted officials, and records of properties they'd successfully stolen. They discovered specialized equipment designed to damage homes while making it look like natural wear and tear. One storage unit contained dozens of different types of spike strips, each designed for specific situations. But the most damning evidence came from the CDA's own security system. They had kept meticulous records of every operation, including video recordings of their training sessions. These videos showed them actually teaching developers how to harass homeowners, forge documents, and manipulate property values. They even had a scoring system for rating how effectively they could force people out of their homes. The prosecutions that followed were unprecedented. Over 200 people were indicted, including developers, local officials, and even some law enforcement officers who had been on the CDA's payroll. The charges ranged from fraud and conspiracy to attempted manslaughter in cases where their tactics had put lives at risk. Rebecca's security camera footage of the spike strip incident became a central piece of evidence in these trials. Prosecutors used it to show how the CDA's tactics had evolved from financial pressure to physical danger. The footage was played in courtroom after courtroom, helping secure convictions against CDA members across the country. The investigation also led to the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen property value. The FBI set up a special task force just to help people who had been forced out of their homes by the CDA's tactics. Many families were able to reclaim properties they had lost years ago, though some homes had already been demolished for development projects. Victoria's sentencing hearing was particularly dramatic. Despite her cooperation, the judge showed no leniency regarding the spike strip incident. Using potentially lethal force to steal someone's property shows a level of disregard for human life that this court cannot overlook, the judge stated. Victoria was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 10 years. The aftermath of the investigation led to major changes in property law across the country. Congress passed the Homeowner Protection Act, which created new federal oversight of development companies and HOAs. The act specifically banned the use of any physical devices or environmental manipulation to force property sales. Rebecca's case became a symbol of resistance against corporate bullying. Her story was featured in documentaries, legal textbooks, and even a best-selling book about property rights in America. The spike strips that had almost destroyed her car were put on display at the FBI Academy as a reminder of how a single piece of evidence can expose a nationwide criminal enterprise. Local communities across the country began dismantling the excessive HOA regulations that had made the CDA's schemes possible. Many states passed their own versions of the Sterling laws, named after Victoria's case, creating strict oversight of community development projects and property management companies. The CDA's training materials were turned into educational resources, teaching law enforcement and homeowners what to watch for. The FBI created a special unit dedicated to investigating property fraud, using lessons learned from the spike strip case to identify similar schemes before they could escalate to violence. And there you have it, everyone. That's the incredible story of how one homeowner's security cameras, some illegal spike strips, and a power-crazy HOA president led to the takedown of a nationwide criminal enterprise. But before we wrap up today's video, I want to share something important with all of you. Since I started covering this story, my inbox has been flooded with messages from people sharing their own experiences with HOA harassment and property rights violations. While most aren't as dramatic as spike strips, they show just how common these problems are. I've heard from elderly couples being harassed over their garden gnomes, young families threatened with eviction over children's playsets, and long-time residents being pressured to sell their homes through various intimidation tactics. This brings me to an important point. If you're dealing with HOA harassment or suspicious development pressure, document everything. Rebecca's case succeeded because she had concrete evidence. Install security cameras, keep records of every interaction, save every letter and email. You never know what might turn out to be important evidence. I've actually spoken with Rebecca recently for an update on her situation. She's doing great and has become an advocate for property rights. She's started a non-profit organization called Homeowners United that helps people fight against property fraud and HOA abuse. They offer free legal advice, security system recommendations, and support for people dealing with similar situations. Here's something fascinating that didn't make it into the main story. Remember those spike strips that started everything? They're now part of a traveling exhibition about property rights in America. Rebecca donated them to a civil rights museum where they're used to educate people about the importance of standing up against institutional bullying. Now, I want to address something many of you have been asking in the comments of my previous videos. What can we do to protect ourselves? Well, I've worked with some legal experts to create a free resource guide that you can download from my website. It includes information about your basic property rights, how to document harassment, when to contact law enforcement, what security measures to consider, how to identify suspicious development patterns. The impact of this case continues to grow. Just last week I received news about another development company being investigated for similar tactics, though thankfully no spike strips this time. Your comments and messages about these videos have actually helped identify several other suspicious operations across the country. For those of you dealing with HOA issues right now, remember this. What happened to Rebecca wasn't just about spike strips or property values. It was about standing up to organized intimidation. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to be bullied, even when it seems like you're fighting alone. I want to give a special shout-out to all the law enforcement officers, FBI, agents, and legal professionals who helped break this case. Many of them have reached out since I started covering this story, sharing additional details and insights about how they tackle these types of investigations. And speaking of insights, next week's video is going to be really special. I've managed to secure an exclusive interview with one of the FBI agents who worked on Operation Property Rights. They're going to share some never-before-heard details about how they coordinated those simultaneous raids. You definitely won't want to miss that. Before we end today's video, I want to thank all of you for your amazing support of this channel. Your engagement with these stories, your comments, and your shares help spread awareness about these issues. Every time you share these videos, you help another homeowner recognize potential threats to their property rights. If you've experienced something similar or have your own HOA story to share, leave a comment below. Remember to keep it civil, though. We want to maintain a constructive discussion that helps people understand their rights and options. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell if you want to catch my upcoming videos about property rights and homeowner protection. We've got some incredible stories coming up, including one about a community that successfully disbanded their corrupt HOA and created a new democratic system of neighborhood governance. Until next time, remember what Rebecca's case taught us. Sometimes the best defense against injustice is simply having the courage to document it and speak up. Stay safe, protect your rights, and I'll see you in the next video. And hey, if you're dealing with HOA issues right now and need support, check out the resources linked in the description. Remember, you're not alone in this fight. Property rights are human rights and they're worth protecting. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.